Hey, before anything else, can I ask you a quick favor? Your subscription is what keeps this channel alive. If you've ever felt something from this story or any of the others, or if this channel has ever made your day better, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps me way more than you can imagine. Now, let's get into the story. The bell over the cafe door chimed in that soft, familiar way that always made me look up from the espresso machine, and there she was again, Katie, tall, graceful, wrapped in the kind of elegance that didn't belong in a corner coffee shop with squeaky chairs and chalkboard menus. She was one of those regulars who never ordered the same thing twice, always taking a second to read the specials like she hadn't memorized them already, and though we'd never spoken beyond the polite exchange of customer and barista, there was something in her eyes that lingered on me a beat too long every time. I told myself it was my imagination. People like her didn't look at people like me, not really. I was Mia, owner of a cafe that barely broke even, working 12-hour days just to keep the lights on, still single at 30 and with a high school reunion coming up that promised nothing but humiliation. 10 years since graduation, 10 years of watching my classmates post perfect lives online while I made cappuccinos. Alone. The thought of walking into that gymnasium, full of people who had never seen me as more than the quiet girl in the back row, made my stomach twist. I'd been trying to come up with an excuse all week, but the RSVP deadline was tomorrow, and my mind kept replaying the same nightmare. Walking in, hearing the whispers, smiling through the pity. When I slid her latte across the counter, Katie's gaze caught mine, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile, like she'd caught me thinking something I didn't want her to know. "You going to that reunion thing this weekend?" she asked casually, like she was asking about the weather. I blinked, startled. "How do you, small town," she said with a shrug, though something in her tone felt more like a secret. "Everyone knows." I tried to laugh it off. "I'm considering it," which was a lie. I was considering locking myself in my apartment with Netflix and takeout until the night was over. "Go," she said, leaning on the counter, her voice dropping into something almost coaxing. "Show them you're not the same girl you were in high school." I scoffed. Unless the girl I was in high school suddenly got a promotion, a ring on her finger, and a personal trainer, I'm pretty sure they'll see exactly what they expect. She tilted her head, studying me with that infuriating, unreadable expression. Then, just as I was about to turn away, she said, "What if you didn't go alone?" I froze. "What?" "I could go with you," she offered lightly, but her eyes stayed locked on mine, searching. "Pretend to be your girlfriend for the night. Make it interesting." I let out a laugh, shaky and incredulous. "You do that? For me?" "Why not?" she said with a small shrug, though I swore there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something sharper, hungrier, before her smile softened again. "Could be fun." I should have said no. I didn't know her, not really. But the image bloomed so vividly in my mind, walking into that gym with someone like Katie at my side, watching every smirk freeze on their faces, that I found myself saying, "Okay." She grinned, slow and triumphant, like she'd been waiting for that answer. "It's a date." The words sent an unexpected heat through me, one I carried the rest of the afternoon, even as I told myself this was just an act, just for one night. But as Katie walked out of the cafe, the soft chime of the door fading behind her, I caught myself wondering why her smile felt like the start of something I wasn't ready to name. I told myself I agreed because I wanted armor, because it would be easier to survive a room of perfect smiles with a beautiful stranger on my arm than with my palms sweating alone. But the truth showed itself in small betrayals. The way I checked my reflection in the espresso machine's chrome after closing, the way I Googled how to not look like you're faking a relationship, and hated every article with stock photos of couples laughing at salads, the way I lay awake and imagined Katie's hand at the small of my back guiding me through the school doors like she belonged there and I belonged anywhere she stood. By morning I was equal parts electricity and dread, and when I flipped the cafe sign to open the bell felt like a countdown. She came at 10 because of course she did, wearing a simple black dress that made my thrift store blouse feel like a dare, her hair pinned back with an old-fashioned barrette that somehow made her more modern, and she slid onto the stool by the register like she had always planned to fit there. "So," she said, eyes bright, "we should align our story. How long have we been together? Where did we meet? Do I have any allergies the charcuterie board should fear?" I choked on a laugh. "You're serious?" "Deadly," she said with a glint I couldn't read, and then softened into that coaxing half-smile again. "If we're going to play this right, you need to feel safe." The way she said safe made heat pool under my skin. We decided on details with a briskness that startled me. Met at the cafe when her laptop died, and I lent her a charger. Started officially dating 3 months ago. She works in consulting, vague enough to explain her disappearing into calls. I hate cilantro, and she threatens to sneak it into my food for science. I worried the lies would tangle, but she was eerily good at stitching them into something that felt like a sweater I could actually wear in public without itching. "I'll pick you up at 7, she said, signing a receipt she didn't need to sign with a fluid hand that looked like it belonged on an invitation. Wear something that makes you feel like a version of yourself you want to see on a night you'll remember. After she left, I closed early, told my one evening regular to come back for free biscotti tomorrow, and stood in my bedroom sighing at my closet like it had personally betrayed me. A blue wrap dress, a red jumpsuit, the safe black skirt I'd worn to a cousin's wedding. None of it felt like armor or softness or whatever magic I would need to step onto a gym floor I'd once crossed with a tray of cookies during a bake sale hoping someone would notice I existed. In the end, I chose a deep green satin slip dress I'd bought on clearance years ago in a burst of optimism and never worn, layered it with a soft gray blazer because I didn't recognize my arms in the mirror without it, and added minimal gold hoops that made me feel like I had a plan. My phone buzzed at 6:57. "Katie." Outside. My stomach flipped. I stepped into the hallway and almost turned back, because how do you walk towards something you want when wanting has only ever gotten you laughed at? But then I opened the door, and there she was leaning against a dark sedan that hummed money, looking at me like I had arrived precisely on time. "You look," she began, and for a second her composure snagged on something in her throat, like the girl everyone will wish they'd paid attention to. The compliment landed, and my ribs remembered how to move. "You clean up okay yourself," I said, which was an insulting understatement because she looked devastating. Charcoal suit tailored to a secret geometry, silk blouse the color of old wine, a thin chain at her collarbone catching the last of the sun like a good omen. We drove with the windows cracked, late summer air moving through the car like a benevolent ghost, neither of us playing music because conversation made its own rhythm. She asked about the cafe, and I told her about the regular who drinks decaf espresso and insists no one understand the taste but him, about the pair of teenage girls who come after school to split a scone and dare each other to talk to their crushes, about the time the milk steamer exploded like a diva and I had to give everyone free Americanos, and learned that generosity buys better reviews than perfection. She listened like I was telling her something not of minor consequence, but of consequence, period. And when she shared, it was like small stones tossed into a pond. Ripples, not splashes. She traveled often, sometimes for long stretches. She'd lived in places that made winter look like a rumor. She liked old movie theaters and street vendors who sell roast nuts. She had a soft spot for abandoned buildings and people who decide not to abandon themselves. "You talk like you've been everywhere," I said. "Everywhere is a lot of places to feed," she murmured, then smiled quickly as if to erase the oddness. The school loomed ahead, brick and nostalgia and the smell of floor wax somehow embedded in the parking lot. Banners announced, "Welcome back, class of 20. Like the decade could be rounded down if the letters were big enough. My hands shook until Katie's fingers slid over mine on the console. Very light, very deliberate. "You don't owe anyone a performance," she said. "But if you want to put on a show, I can be your lighting design." I laughed, and the laugh turned into a breath I could stand on. The moment we walked in, the gym hit me with that old cocktail of fluorescent lighting and a DJ trying to remember how to read a room, balloons hovering like polite planets, fold-out tables groaning under catered nostalgia, pigs in blankets, spinach dip, a mountain of cupcakes with sprinkles in school colors. There were faces I recognized instantly, and faces that became familiar as names scribbled on so many math quizzes resurfaced like ghosts. And then the whispers I feared did start, but they were softer than memory had promised, and they tilted toward awe when Katie's hand settled at my waist, and she kissed my temple in a gesture so natural it felt rehearsed through lifetimes. "Mia," squealed a voice that made my spine register both dread and an old, embarrassing crush, and I turned to see Ava Harper, the former prom queen, homecoming queen, queen of every hallway conversation, approaching in a gold dress designed to demonstrate the concept of gravity. Time had been unfair to many of us, but to Ava it had been a sponsor. "You look amazing," she said, eyes scanning me head to toe like an appraisal she fully intended to pass, and then her gaze slid to Katie and widened. "And who is this?" "Katie," my fake girlfriend said, offering a hand with practiced warmth. "Mia's girlfriend." Ava's lashes fluttered. She hadn't expected that sentence to be said out loud by anyone, let alone me. "I didn't know you were happy," Katie supplied, and something complicated crossed Ava's face before she clicked back into her best pageant smile.
"Yes.
"Happy.
Wow.
Good for you." She hugged me, leaving a hint of expensive perfume on my blazer, and leaned in to whisper, "We should catch up later." Alone, like the italicized word had been waiting on her tongue for 10 years. Jealousy is a creature with quick teeth. I felt Katie go very still for a heartbeat, and then her hand at my back pressed closer, possessive but not unkind, a punctuation mark that told the sentence not to wander. "We'll be around," she said pleasantly, steering me toward the refreshment table with a tiny, triumphant arch of an eyebrow that made laughter swell in my chest. "You okay?" she asked under the music, low, and I nodded, more than okay, drunk on the social judo of walking through a space that used to make me smaller and feeling impossibly larger. The night spun itself into a nostalgic centrifuge. Yearbook slides on a projector, the Spanish teacher telling stories with too much detail, the track star who now sold insurance trying to start a conga line, Journey twice, Rihanna once, then the slow curve into 2000s ballads that made everyone suddenly 19. Through it, Katie was perfect, the kind of perfect that doesn't show seams, laughing at old jokes without condescension, listening to my former lab partner describe his microbrewery with actual curiosity, drawing me into conversations only when she could see I wanted to be seen, when a trio at the Punch Bowl tried a round of backhanded compliments about how brave I was to open my own business in a market like this. She nodded along and then, with her softest, sharpest voice, asked them about their passions until the air between us filled with their silence. When I saw my old crush, Nora, painter, dress code violator, heartbreaker, standing by the bleachers, Katie eased away so I could say hello, and when Nora told me she'd always admired the way I drew fairy tale castles in the margins of my notebooks, Katie's pride in me felt like an additional light source. "How did you know about that?" I asked her later, cheeks hot with the warmth of being noticed across time. "You doodled them on your senior year binder," she said, offhand, like it was obvious. "You noticed my binder?" "I notice you," she said simply, and the answer hit me harder than the gym's reverb. It should have been only an act, only a list of behaviors, but the more the night pressed, the more the boundaries blurred. Katie was funny in a way that didn't demand the room's laughter as payment, and she was kind with a precision that avoided pity but landed as care, and every now and then, when she thought I wasn't looking, longing leapt across her face so quick and naked it made my knees weak. Then came the slideshow. Someone had collected an offensive number of candid photos and set them to a pop-punk anthem, and there I was, braces, bangs, hoodie 3 sizes too big, at a pep rally, half hidden behind a sign. There I was on the sophomore field trip, pretending to read a map while everyone else posed. There I was in the cafeteria, laughing at something off-camera with my mouth open and unafraid. The room made the usual noises, but my chest went strange, because I didn't remember that version of myself. Unguarded, halfway to brave. Katie's fingers found mine. "She's still in there," she murmured. "I can tell. She's louder than you think." I squeezed back, and the squeeze said, "I believe you, even if I don't know how yet." Halfway through the night, Ava reappeared, wine-flushed and shining like she had practiced a glow, and swooped me away with a practiced claim that ignored the fact that I was attached to someone else. "Dance with me," she chirped, not asking, already pulling me to the edge of the floor where the DJ had smartly downshifted into an early 2000s slow jam that had scored more teenage heartbreaks than any guidance counselor could count. "Ava," I began, but she pressed a finger to my lips in a gesture that must have seemed charming in her head, and all I could think was how I had spent an entire sophomore year trying to learn how to be the kind of person someone might hush. "It's just a song," she said, eyes flicking fast to where Katie stood across the gym watching us with that careful stillness she wore like silk. "Old times." "We've never danced," I said, and Ava laughed, breath warm with Chardonnay.
Exactly.
"We should correct the oversight." We swayed, and for a second I let the motion scrub my nerves, but when her hands slid lower than a friend's would, and she leaned in like she meant to claim something she hadn't asked permission to touch, I pulled back, probably too quickly. "Ava," I said low. "No," she blinked, surprised for real this time, as if the night had misread its own script.
Oh.
"I just thought. I mean, you always had those hard eyes, and I figured. Love what you've seen so far, and want to help me keep creating these awesome stories on this channel? Then subscribe and hit the bell. Your subscription supports the channel and makes sure you get more exciting stories." "I don't," I said, sharper than I intended, dizzy with the shame of high school resurrecting itself to tap my shoulder like a ghost wanting one last dance. Her mouth tightened, and in the space of that small movement I understood her particular kindnesses had always been transactional, flavored with the expectation of being repaid in adoration. "Right," she said too brightly.
"Well,
"Your loss." She lifted her chin and pivoted away in search of someone more likely to play by her rules. When I looked up, Katie was already at my side, not touching me, simply there, close enough that I could step into her if I needed to, far enough that I didn't feel penned. "You okay?" she asked, voice even. I used to think proximity to her would save me, I admitted, and hated how thin my voice sounded against the gym's thickness. Turns out she's just a person who thinks the world owes her return on interest. "Some people are loan sharks when it comes to attention," Katie said lightly, then added more solemn. "I'm proud of you." The words undid me a little. "For what?" "For knowing what you want," she said. "And what you don't." The song ended. Applause rose for a speech about scholarships. A cluster formed around the man who'd gone viral for a TEDx talk about startups. The janitor, whose name none of us had learned in high school, got a standing ovation that made me cry in a way the prom king's retrospective didn't. The night began to soften its edges, and my fear of being publicly humiliated felt suddenly quaint compared to the private danger of standing 3 inches from a woman who kept saying the exact right thing, in exactly the right tone to make my heart build a new map. "How do you know so much about me?" I asked, half joking, half serious. "You sit by the window when you're anxious and by the pastry case when you're sad," she said without pause. "You stir your coffee clockwise when you're making a plan and counterclockwise when you're trying to forget one. You prefer drizzle to downpour, Prince to Springsteen, savory to sweet unless you're exhausted, in which case you'll eat marshmallows like a raccoon. You have a scar above your left knee from falling off your bike when you were 11 and a chipped second molar you won't fix because you still remember the dentist's breath. You fell in love once with a girl who could draw wings that looked like they wanted to fly off the page, and you pretended it was admiration because you didn't know where to put a word like love at 17. My mouth had parted somewhere around marshmallows. When did you see my knee? You wore shorts when the AC broke last July, she said, a little sheepish at last. I notice you, she repeated, and if the room had dissolved into glitter and air, I might not have noticed. It wasn't just that she'd watched me. It was that she had seen me, and the difference landed like a warm cloth on a fever. Later, when the DJ made a bad choice and put on a line dance, I ducked out to catch my breath, thinking I'd splash water on my face in the bathroom and practice not spiraling into 10-year-old shame again. The hallways smelled like disinfectant and nostalgia, lockers lined up like ribs, a trophy case glinting with accomplishments I'd never touched. I passed the girls' locker room and, on impulse I couldn't name, pushed the door open. It was quieter in there, The bass line from the gym muffled to a friendly thump. The overheads hummed. A string of paper lanterns someone had hung near the mirrors pulsed a soft blue. I expected to find a couple sneaking kisses, a clique-fixing lipstick, some giggly conspiracy. Instead, I found silence. And then a sound that wasn't silence at all, thin and wet and wrong, like a straw in a drink without ice. "Katie," I called, because that was the kind of night it had become. I looked for her without thinking. "In here," she answered from the far showers, voice bright, too bright, and I turned the corner and my brain fell down a flight of stairs. She stood with her back to me, jacket shrugged off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. In her hand, a clear medical bag half-drained of dark red liquid, tube looping, clamp open. Her mouth moved against the rubber like a musician adjusting a reed, careful and practiced. When she turned, those elegant eyes had burned to something lambent, pupils blown, irises catching the low light in a way that made my skin go cold. Her lips were stained, and for an instant, before she wiped them with the back of her wrist in a gesture so human it felt like a lie, I saw them differently, saw teeth too white, canines too long, a flash of something sharp tucked in a smile I had been falling into all night. "Don't," she said, palms up, voice low and deliberate, the opposite of threat, the exact pitch of please. "Don't run." I didn't run. My body wanted to, but the same curiosity that makes you read the ending before you're halfway through the book pinned my shoes to the tile. The bag swung gently from her hand. "Is that I couldn't finish?" "It is," she said calmly. "From the hospital. Legally acquired, no one hurt, no midnight alley melodrama. I'm careful." I stared and stared more, and my head tried to put everything back into the box labeled normal while my eyes kept dumping it out. Yes, she said, not letting me say the word. "But also I'm Katie, the one who knows where you keep the emergency biscotti and how you take your coffee when you're about to call your landlord and the exact face you make when someone says exposure instead of pay. I'm the one who offered to stand between you and a room full of people who made you small on purpose. And I am the one who just did a deeply unromantic thing in a locker room because the alternative would have been passing out in the 10th minute of a line dance." Humor a thin thread. I didn't laugh. My hands shook. I tucked them under my arms to point the tremor inward. "Why me?" I asked, and the question had edges I hadn't meant to sharpen. It wasn't the obvious, "Why did you pick me to pretend with?" It was the real one. "Why have you looked at me like a person you already love?" She swallowed, and the motion did strange, beautiful things to her throat. "Because you make me want to be better at passing," she said simply. "And because I've watched you for a long time, and I like the ways you are brave, and I like the ways you think you aren't. Because you did not weaponize your loneliness and hand it to someone else to hold. Because your laugh makes rooms honest. Because you once gave a free muffin to a kid who pretended he didn't want it so he could pretend he didn't need it. Because..." She closed her eyes briefly, as if remembering to keep one truth back. "Because I wanted to see if an impossible night could be true. It should have been too much. It should have been manipulation. It should have been a dozen things that broke me into leaving. Instead it settled like a stone into a jar and made the water rise to a new measurement." "How long?" I asked. "A while," she said, corner of her mouth tilting in rue. "Long enough to have attendance cards from your first cafe opening, long enough to have an opinion about your original logo, long enough that I've learned every bus schedule that passes your street and which ones arrive 10 minutes late." "That's not creepy," I muttered, and she winced. "I know. I'm trying to be less predatory." The last word hung between us like something with teeth. From the gym, the DJ shouted something about a group photo. Laughter rolled down the hall like a wave. In the bluish locker room light, Katie looked more human than any vampire should be allowed to look, and more monstrous than any woman I'd allowed myself to want. A stupid, desperate part of me reached for a joke and found none. "So this is the part where I should run screaming and you chase me and we crash through the trophy case?" I said, voice thin. "Please don't," she said, a whisper. "I won't chase. I will leave if you tell me to. I will never come to your cafe again. I will move. I will learn to like tea. But if you can stand in a room with this version of me, If you can hold it even for an hour, I will prove that tonight wasn't a lie. I didn't fake wanting to be beside you. The pretending was just a container. In another life, I would have closed my eyes and pointed at a moral and followed it. In this one, I stood looking at a woman who had guarded me all night with a fierceness that felt like a vow, whose hands shook only when she kept them away from me, whose mouth had tasted like secrets and now tasted like blood, and I could not make my feet choose a simple direction. We need to go back, I said at last, because practicality is the god you pray to when the others stop taking your calls. If we disappear, they'll think I fled the room because Ava said something or because your dress code violated the PDA's sense of decorum. Her laugh was half a breath, grateful, disbelieving. Okay. She dropped the empty bag into a small black pouch I realized was a cooler, zipped it with neat efficiency, and wiped her mouth again until the stain faded. Then she did something that made my throat close. She stepped back farther than arm's length and lifted her hands to show me they were empty. You set the pace, she said. Tonight and after. If there's an after. I didn't answer that. I couldn't. I walked past her, and my shoulder brushed hers by accident, and the contact shot through both of us like a live wire. Her eyes darkened, hunger flaring and raining itself with visible effort. See, she whispered, not to convince me, but to warn herself. This is why I drank here. So I wouldn't mistake want for need. Back in the gym, the lights had dimmed to that flattering amber that makes regret look cinematic. People were gathering for the class picture, tallest in back, shortest in front, a middle line of kids who had learned to make themselves exactly as visible as they intended to be. Nora waved me over. Ava shot me a look like a sparkler burning out. Katie slipped to my side and, without touching me, formed a kind of shield with her presence. Smile, the photographer called. 3, 2, and I did, an expression that felt shockingly like the real thing because whatever came after, whatever lines we crossed or redrew, I had walked into this room worried I would be small, and I had not been small. The flash popped. Everyone exhaled. And as the crowd spilled into loose knots again, as the DJ promised a final slow dance that would make us all 15, as someone popped a confetti cannon prematurely and got a scolding and a cheer, Katie leaned in, careful, reverent, dangerous. If you want me to leave, she said, say the word. I had 100. None of them were leave. I didn't say leave, I said, stay close, and Katie did, orbit tightening without touch, the kind of careful that made me feel both seen and safely invisible. The DJ slid into a late-night 2000s slow jam that made every pair in the room try on the memory of being tender, and as people drifted to the floor, Nora shot me a thumbs up like we were co-conspirators in a better timeline. The Spanish teacher cried at a slideshow of awkward prom crowns, and then Ava materialized again with wine-bright cheeks and a determination that might have been called romantic in a movie made by someone who never learned the word no. One dance, just us. She purred, reaching for my wrist, and before I could reframe it, Katie stepped in with surgical grace, not blocking, simply existing in the path like a polite force field, her voice low enough to be kind and unmistakable as a locked door. She's taken. And the possessive pronoun went through me like heat. Ava smiled too widely, tilted her head like she was posing for a painting of magnanimity, and then leaned as if to brush a kiss over my cheek but miscalculated, mouth angling toward mine because entitlement makes poor mathematicians. Time stretched, the gym buzzed, and I felt old panic stir, the fear of being made a spectacle, but before it could bite, I set my palm against Ava's shoulder and said, steady. I said no, the word clean as glass. For a fraction of a beat, Ava looked honestly stunned. Then the queen returned to her throne, chin tipping, sarcasm primed, and that was when Katie's composure frayed a millimeter. Something ancient flickered in her eyes, a warning shine. Not for Ava, for herself, and I felt the air pressure around us shift like weather deciding which town to flood. Don't, I breathed, not to Ava, to Katie, and her lashes lowered as if she'd just remembered how to pray, hunger caged not by shame but by choice. I won't, she whispered, and it wasn't a promise to me, it was a vow to the room. Still, the moment had teeth, and it wanted to bite someone. So Ava bit first, soft and mean. "You're different tonight, Mia. I never took you for a girl who hides behind a bodyguard." And I laughed because suddenly I wasn't hiding behind anyone. I was standing in front of myself, and I said, "I'm not hiding. I'm being chosen." And it landed like a small earthquake whose epicenter was my spine. Katie's breath eased. Envy melted from her mouth into something humbler. She offered Ava a truce none of us deserved. We all grow up, and guided me toward the dance floor with the lightest pressure at my back. The message clear: if you want to be here, I will give you cover. If you want to leave, I will be the exit sign. We danced bumper car slow among classmates revising their teenage myths, her hand at my waist respectful and proprietary, my cheek near her temple catching the faintest trace of the iron-clean scent she'd worked so hard to conceal. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. I wanted to ask none, but the music did the talking for us until she murmured, "Ground rules." Like she'd been rehearsing telling me the truth since the first time I handed her a latte. I don't hunt. I don't glamour. I don't turn. I feed from bags or willing donors who know exactly what I am. I don't run when I'm afraid. I ask. I don't lie unless lying keeps someone alive. If you ever tell me to stop anything, I stop, and every sentence was a stone laid where I could walk without looking down. "Do you compel people?" I asked, not liking the way the word fell on my tongue. "I can," she admitted, quiet, "but I don't. Consent is the only thing that tastes good," and the sentence shook me with a relief I didn't know I'd been hoarding. "Why my reunion?" I pushed, and her mouth ghosted my hairline, unkissed almost. "Because I wanted you to get one night where the story ends with you bigger than you walked in," she said. "And because I've wanted to be the person standing next to you while that happens for longer than I can say without scaring you. And before I could ask longer how long." The principal tapped the mic. The gym erupted into a raffle for a basket of artisanal hot sauces, and Katie leaned back to grin at me like joy could be simple. The next hour blurred into a collage of ordinary miracles. My ex-lab partner introduced his husband and pressed a business card into my hand offering wholesale beans for the cafe. Nora dragged us into the photo booth where we crammed into a strip that caught me laughing with my eyes closed and Katie looking at me like she was signing a lease on devotion. Someone spilled punch on my shoes and apologized profusely, and Katie knelt with napkins as if my dignity were something you could blot. Twice. I found her staring at the exit doors with a focus that felt like weather radar, and when I asked, she said, "Counting heartbeats," like it was a perfectly normal answer, adding, "Mine included," and I rolled my eyes and felt strangely safe being cataloged. Then the band of Time Around Midnight tightened, and the final slow song arrived. The lights falling to a honey low, the bleachers lined with spectators pretending not to evaluate happiness like it was a competition. We drifted to the middle, and something in me unclenched so profoundly, I nearly swayed on the spot. "Tell me a truth," I said, because the locker room had knocked us out of orbit and I needed a new gravity. She breathed in like she was tasting the room and said, "Truth, I used to sit outside your cafe the winter you opened and watch you close. And when you cried in the dark once because the register didn't match and the milk had gone bad, and you thought this meant you were a failure, I promised myself if I ever earned your trust, one would hand you a night where the world agreed you existed the way I see you. And if I hadn't already been on the verge of choosing something irrevocable, that would have done it. My truth." I offered. Heart a bell struck clean. "I have wanted someone to look at me the way you look at me since I was 15, and I kept telling myself I wanted Ava's crown when all I wanted was not to be invisible. You make me feel like I can be witnessed without being devoured." And her breath caught, a sound as human as any I'd ever heard. Which is exactly when a universe, devoted to dramatic irony, sent Ava back for one last scene. Champagne courage bubbling too close to rage. She cut across the floor with her smile too white and, as if she decided her narrative required a scandal, reached for my face, fingers spreading to frame like a photograph, and aimed her mouth determinately at mine. Time didn't slow, it sharpened. I stepped back, clear and quick, and her kiss landed on my cheekbone, sloppy and shocked, and the room made an oh noise like a middle school audience. Katie's hand found my wrist, not yanking, anchoring, and the sound that left her a near-silent, old country rumble. Wasn't for the room, it was for the part of herself that wanted to turn the air to teeth. I looked at her deliberately, said her name like a spell. Katie, and it scattered the hunger, her shoulders lowering under a restraint that felt less like denial and more like discipline. "I'm fine," I told her, then to Ava, not unkind. "You're drunk on memory. Go drink water." And for a heartbeat, I saw the exact girl she'd been, tired, afraid of losing a power she never asked to carry, before she tossed her hair and let herself be led away by a clutch of admirers who wanted a story for brunch. After that, something in the room relaxed, as if we'd all been waiting to see whether I would shrink. I didn't. Neither did Katie. We stayed on the floor, and when the last chorus hit, I laid my head against her shoulder and felt the strangest peace, the kind that comes from choosing a future you can't fully name. "You're trembling," she murmured. "I'm rewiring," I said, and her laugh was so gentle it felt like proof. The DJ thanked us for coming. People clapped like they were applauding themselves for surviving their own legends. The superintendent turned on the brighter lights and the magic thinned into cleanup. I walked with Katie toward the hallway where our coats hung and felt the night finally ask its question. The one it had been circling since the bell over my cafe chimed, and she walked in like a foreshadow. "Do you want me to come home with you?" she asked. "Cautious, Reverend. Only to your door. 2. See you inside. Nothing else. Or, do you want me to vanish until you can breathe through this?" And I surprised both of us by saying, "Come. Stay on the other side of the room if you need to. Sit by the window like you do in the mornings. Let me decide sentence by sentence." And the relief that flickered across her face wasn't hungry. It was holy. We stepped out into the night air that smelled like cut grass and old wax and the next decade. And as we walked to her car, I realized the humiliation I dreaded had come and gone in the form of a stolen almost kiss, and what remained was a problem I wanted: how to love a person who had told me the worst true thing about herself and then behaved as if I deserved the best true things anyway. The drive from the school to my apartment was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not the strained silence of people running out of things to say, but the kind where each thought is measured before it's let into the air. Streetlights passed over us like brief interrogations, painting her face in alternating strips of shadow and gold, and I kept catching myself glancing at her profile, the slope of her jaw, the way her hand rested light but deliberate on the gear shift, like she could crush it. And never would. I didn't know if it was her presence or the aftershock of the night, but my chest felt like it had been cracked open and filled with warm wind. "You really were ready to bite her," I said finally, not accusing, more like testing the weight of the truth between us. Her lips curved, but not into humor. Not bite. Not there. But yes, I wanted to correct her. "It's instinct." She challenged me, tried to take what wasn't hers, and in my world that has consequences. Her voice was even, almost clinical, but I could hear the effort it cost to keep it there. "And in mine," I said softly, "we call that jealousy." She didn't look at me, but I saw the smallest twitch in her cheek, like she was fighting the admission. "Maybe," she murmured. "Or maybe I don't like watching someone try to reduce you to a prop in their play." My throat tightened. I had spent so much of my life being furniture in someone else's scene that hearing it named so plainly was both a sting and a salve. When we pulled up outside my building, she didn't kill the engine right away. "Last chance to change your mind," she said, eyes still on the windshield. "You can tell me goodnight, and I'll go. No hurt feelings, no future awkwardness at the cafe." "You really think you can make coffee without awkwardness after tonight?" I asked, and she finally laughed, low and unguarded, the kind of sound that makes you want to earn it again. I didn't think, just said, "Come upstairs." She followed me up the narrow staircase, her presence behind me somehow steadying. Inside, I kicked off my shoes and shrugged out of my blazer, feeling suddenly aware of the slip dress beneath, the way satin clings like it knows too much. She took in the small space without judgment, the bookshelf crammed with cookbooks and thrifted novels, the chipped mug collection, the potted plants that stubbornly refused to die. "It's very you," she said simply, and somehow that felt more intimate than any compliment on my appearance could have. I poured us both water, because it was the most neutral thing I could think to do, and she accepted the glass with a nod, sitting in the chair by the window like she'd said she would. For a while we just talked, the kind of drifting conversation that's half nostalgia, half cautious excavation. I told her about the first time I ever felt invisible in a crowded room, and she told me about the first time she ever realized she wasn't like other people. Not in the storybook different way, but in the literal, immortal sense. It was 1908, she said, as casually as if she were reciting a recipe. I was 19. I had just buried my mother. And then I stopped aging. I listened, half expecting some grand Gothic flourish, but the way she spoke was almost gentle, like she was sparing me the sharper edges. You've seen more than a century of reunions, I said, and she smiled faintly. Enough to know they're never really about the past. They're about the person you want to pretend you've become. I wanted to ask her everything, about wars and loves and how many times she'd had to start over, but I also wanted to keep the night balanced on this strange thread between us, not heavy enough to snap, not light enough to float away. Around midnight, I noticed the way her shoulders eased, the faint tension in her jaw loosening, and I realized she'd been listening to my heartbeat the whole time, calibrating herself to it. You're not afraid, she said quietly, almost to herself. I was, I admitted. In the locker room, for a second, I thought I didn't know you at all. But then I realized, I do. I've been watching you watch me for months. And whatever you are, you've never made me feel unsafe. That earned me a look I couldn't quite name, part gratitude, part hunger, part something older than either. Mia, she began, but then stopped, like she decided it was too soon to say what came next. Instead she stood, moving toward the door with a grace that felt both reluctant and deliberate. I should go, she said. You should rest. Tonight was a lot. I surprised myself again. Stay, I said, the word quiet but certain. Not here, she replied instantly. If I stay this close, I won't sleep. And you need to. There was no teasing in her tone, only a strange reverence. She reached for my hand, lifting it slowly, brushing her lips over my knuckles with a touch that made my pulse kick. Tomorrow, she said. And then she was gone, leaving my apartment quieter than it had been in years, but somehow fuller. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, and realized that the humiliation I dreaded all week had been replaced by something far more dangerous, the possibility that I was falling for her, fangs and all. I woke to my phone buzzing against a glass of water at 1:13 a.m., the kind of hour that makes choices feel both braver and stupider. And for a beat, I thought it was a dream until Nora's name lit the screen with a text that read, "Are you awake //? There's an unofficial after-hours thing back at the gym // committee is cleaning up and people are hanging around // Also Ava is telling anyone who'll listen that you attacked her, which, yikes, come if you want witnesses." The word witnesses hit something in me that had been building all night, an unwillingness to go back to being the version of myself that lets other people write the captions. And before I could talk myself out of it, I threw on sneakers, grabbed my blazer like a talisman, and texted Katie without planning the sentence and yet finding it perfect. Are you up // I'm heading back // I don't want to walk into that story alone. Her reply arrived like breath on my neck. Outside in 5, and the speed of it tugged a laugh out of me because of course she was awake. Night suited her in ways morning never would. When I opened my door, she was already at the bottom of the stairs, hair down now, jacket swapped for a black sweater that made her look softer, more dangerous, more real, and the way her eyes checked my face first, then my hands, then the rest of me like a quick litany of "Is she okay?" made something in my ribcage rethread. You didn't have to come, I said, although I had asked, and she tilted her head like I had told a joke she liked. I'm trying not to be everywhere you look, she answered, but I refuse to be nowhere when you ask, and that line felt like a handrail on a staircase I hadn't known was steep. The drive took 6 minutes and 3 heartbeats I noticed only because she kept time with them, fingers drumming a rhythm on the steering wheel that matched mine, and when we pulled into the unlit back lot the gym hummed with a low, conspiratorial music of people who have decided to extend a night past its official borders, muffled laughter, a boom box somebody resurrected, the wet slop of mops, the bright squeak of a balloon losing air like a dying laugh. Inside, The fluorescent lights had been traded for strings of cafeteria twinkle, the DJ long gone. The punch spiked with something honest, half the class barefoot, half in formal shoes that looked wrong on a basketball court. The custodians kinging slowly in their domain while accepting slices of leftover sheet cake as tribute. Nora popped up. From behind a table she was collapsing, wrapped me in a hug that smelled like paint and sugar, and raised her brows at Katie in a way that said, "So we're all admitting this is not only pretend now. Good, excellent, continue." We pitched in, sweeping confetti into piles that refused to commit, scraping frosting off a bleacher step, listening to story fragments drift like dandelion seeds. Who broke up? Who made up? Whose baby had finally slept through the night, until the room felt more like a living room than a place that had taught me about exits. Then, inevitably, Ava's orbit intersected ours, her crown a little crooked, her smile a little chipped, two friends flanking her like parentheses. "So," she announced loudly enough for the rafters to care, "should I expect a handwritten apology for that slap?" And my laugh came out reflexive, because this was the part where the script expected me to cave to a narrative I hadn't written. "You kissed my face without asking," I said calmly, sweeping confetti to punctuate. "No apology is forthcoming." And when her mouth opened to draft a new grievance, Katie slid into the conversation with an elegance that turned defense into civility. "Ava, if you want to be remembered kindly, choose a gentler last scene tonight." And for a breath the former queen teetered on the edge of cruelty or grace like a gymnast deciding whether to stick a landing. She sighed, cheeks coloring with a human kind of embarrassment, and looked at me, not over me, not through me, and said, smaller, "I'm sorry I made you feel like an accessory," and the apology wasn't perfect, but it was uncoached. And something in me relaxed one notch, because I didn't need her absolution, but I did need my body to know it could survive this room without bracing. "Thank you," I said, and because I am not built to collect enemies like trading cards, I added, "Drink water," which earned a wet laugh, and her friends tugging her toward the fountain. Cleanup devolved into a last song mood without the structure of an actual song. Someone put on an old playlist from a phone. The Spanish teacher slow danced with the janitor to "I'm Yours." Nora taught three dads a clumsy box step. The superintendent abandoned dignity and boxed up cupcakes like a pirate counting gold. In this looser gravity, Katie stayed within reach, but not in the way, a tide that would carry me if I chose to float. I kept catching myself staring at her mouth and having to reorganize my priorities around being a person who could hold a broom and also want to press a centuries-old woman into a wall. To cool my face, I ferried a stack of plastic cups toward the trash, misjudged a step, and because the universe loves symbolism, a shallow crack in the court caught my toe and I pitched forward, catching myself on a table edge with my palm and slicing it open on some invisible sliver. The sting lit up my nerves, bright and hot, and I had enough time to think, oh cliché, before the blood welled glossy and too red and Katie's head snapped toward me like a compass finding north. Her pupils went wide, breath pulled sharp, a hurricane rained by a thread, and for a second I saw everything she held back, all that practiced restraint straining to be worthy of the word safe. And then she moved, slow, hands visible, voice steadier than mercy. "Mia, may I help?" And the old me would have hidden, would have stuffed my hand in my jacket and run. The night made me offer her the wound like a test I hoped she would pass and a benediction I didn't understand I was giving. She didn't touch me first. She touched the environment, pushed a chair aside with her calf to create space, plucked a clean napkin from an untouched stack, tore it, pressed the thicker strip into my good hand. "You press," and only then, when I nodded, did she cradle my wrist, not the cut, lifting it to eye level. Hunger and care warring on a battlefield she had clearly memorized. She turned a little away from the room to give me privacy that also protected her from the casual cruelty of witnesses, and up close I could hear the breath she was counting like a mantra, could smell the copper sweetness she was denying, could see the back of her throat work as if swallowing nowhere labor. "I'm okay," I whispered. A ridiculous thing to say to a person fighting a war against an organ, and her laugh was breathless and grateful and so human. Nora materialized with a first aid kit like a stage manager who knew where every prop lived, and together, under the exhausted twinkle lights, We rinsed and bandaged the cut, Nora chattering on purpose about thread counts and adhesives, Katie's fingers leaving my skin exactly when necessity ended, as if reverence were a muscle she'd been strengthening for decades. When it was done, and my hand was wrapped like a small, smug burrito, Katie exhaled, a tremor leaving her shoulders like a ghost. And I realized my fear, of her, of hunger, of ruin, had been drowned out by the louder knowledge that she wanted me more than she wanted the easiest version of herself, and that felt like the only kind of wanting I could trust. The after hours drifted toward a second ending. People hugged the too-long hug of those surprised to find they like each other after all. The custodians reclaimed their kingdom with broom scepters. The superintendent discovered a forgotten tray of mini quiches and became a folk hero. Nora squeezed my shoulder and promised to drop by the cafe to paint a chalk mural in exchange for macchiatos. Then left with two art teachers who had found each other at 12:03 and were treating it like fate. The gym thinned to a dozen, then half, then 5, and the silence that followed was not the naked kind that demands you fill it. It was the kind that lets one sentence speak. "Walk with me," Katie said, not a command, and we wandered the darkened hallways where our feet had learned routes to classes we no longer needed. Past the trophy case, she read plaques out loud in a bad announcer voice until I laughed so hard my bandage tingled. Past the theater door, I revealed I had auditioned once and forgotten my line and fled. She confessed she had performed as a god in a 1920s Greek revival and had been heckled for being too literally immortal. And finally into the nurse's office because it felt transgressive to sit on vinyl cots after hours. She perched on a stool, hands clasped like a scientist about to present a paper, and said, "If you are going to keep me in your life for longer than a night, I want you to have tools," then pulled her sweater sleeve back to reveal a narrow stainless steel bracelet etched with a symbol that looked like a tiny fountain. "If I am hungry and you are near and you want me to stop before I say to press here hard," she explained, guiding my bandaged finger to the device. "It triggers, call it a failsafe. It hurts and it works. I built it in 1974 when I was dating a girl who loved roller derby and insisted I sit trackside. I've learned to engineer for my weaknesses," she added, half wry, half ashamed. I stared at the bracelet like it was an engagement ring in another language, an artifact that said, "I know what I am, and I am choosing not to be the worst version." "Does it? What does it feel like?" I asked, and she gave me the dignity of the true answer, like swallowing a fist, like kneeling when I don't want to, like the opposite of hunger, and the honesty of it peeled some old fear out of me like a splinter. "I don't want to punish you for existing," I said, the sentence landing heavier than I meant, and exactly as much as I meant. And she closed her eyes for a beat, mouth tilted, as if the relief of being read correctly was a heat source. Somewhere down the hall a door clanged and Ava's laugh tumbled after it, followed by a mutter of, "Well, I guess she likes spooky." And the fact that I didn't flinch, didn't fold my body around shame, felt like proof we were already building a room in which their commentary had to knock. We sat there not touching, cataloging breaths, until the clock on the wall ticked itself into 2:47 and the custodians flicked a warning light. Walking back through the gym felt like saying goodnight to a stage that had finally let me say my lines, and at the back doors, under the exit signs read insistence, Katie stopped as if aligning an internal compass and asked, careful as a prayer, "What do you need from me when morning comes? What do you need me not to be?" And the fact that she placed the weight of the ask on me, not on her hunger or her history, made answering easier. "I need you to keep telling me the unromantic parts," I said, and her smile flashed like a match. "Done," she promised, then added, with a mischief that had made the night bearable. "In exchange, I need you to tell me when you're about to eat marshmallows like a raccoon so I can hide them." And I barked a laugh loud enough to earn a shoo from the hallway. We stepped into the night air, cooler now, cleaner, and for a moment we simply stood, the school hulking behind us like a myth we had finally edited. The parking lot lights buzzed, a moth harassed a bulb, and she turned to me with that look that has been steady for months under its disguises, adoration stripped of performance, and I thought about kissing her, really kissing her. Not the borrowed kiss of a fake date, but the first kiss of a true story, and then a voice cut through, bright with phone-lit glee. "Smile," and a flash stuttered from across the lot. "Ava," cheeks pinked with second-wind bravado, had lifted her phone and captured a picture of us standing too close under the exit sign. And in the next breath she was typing, thumbs flying, into the reunion group thread whose notifications had been chiming all night, and my stomach flipped at the thought of my face appearing under a caption I hadn't written. Before panic could grow fangs, Katie spoke, low and calm enough to leash the moment. Let her post. The worst thing that happens is a town learns you are held by someone who would rather die than embarrass you. And the sentence slid under my skin like a new kind of armor. The message pinged. Ava had gone with something almost sweet. Last one's out. The kiss emoji, a relic from a decade of meaning 3 different things. And instead of wanting to vanish, I wanted to reply with a photo of my bandage and a cupcake and a caption that said survived. Take me home, I said, and in the car the quiet felt different. No longer an empty room, more like a place 2 people had agreed to meet whenever the world became too loud. At my door she didn't ask to come in, and I didn't invite, and the ache of not kissing took on the good shape of promise. She lifted my hand, the wrapped one, and kissed the back of the bandage like a knight with modern manners, then stepped back, eyes a little wild and entirely gentle, and said, "Tomorrow I'll be a customer again, and you can decide whether to comp my coffee." And I said, "I'll charge you double and call it a vampire tax," and her laugh lit the stairwell like a bulb that had been waiting to be switched on for a century. When I fell into bed at 3:21 a.m., the ceiling looked less like a lid and more like a sky, and sleep came fast and brave, and somewhere between dream and morning I understood that whatever we were doing had stopped being a lie the second I chose to walk back into that gym with her and let the night see us, and that realization didn't scare me. It steadied me like a name spoken by someone who means it. Morning came in that hesitant winter way, pale light sneaking between the blinds like it was asking permission, and I surfaced from sleep with the smell of espresso and warm pastry in my head before realizing it wasn't a dream. My phone was buzzing with a text from Katie. Outside // don't argue / there's coffee and a cinnamon roll with your name on it. I padded to the door barefoot, hoodie half-zipped, hair in a state I refused to evaluate, and there she was on the stoop, holding 2 to-go cups from a place I didn't recognize and a white paper bag that already smelled like something worth forgiving sins for. She looked absurdly awake, hair pulled back in a knot, sweater sleeves pushed up, and her eyes did that sweep again, face, hands, everything in one quick check, before softening into a smile that made me forget about the fact that I was basically greeting her in pajamas. "You're supposed to be sleeping in after a night like that," I mumbled as I took the coffee, and she tilted her head, amused, and missed the chance to see what you look like when you're not carrying the weight of the entire reunion on your shoulders. "No, thank you." Inside, I cleared the counter for the bag while she poured the cinnamon roll onto a plate with unnecessary ceremony, sliding it toward me like a peace offering. "What are we making peace for?" I asked, and she shrugged. "For the fact that I left last night without kissing you, which I have decided was either my best decision or my biggest mistake, and I'm not sure which yet." I choked on a bite, and she laughed, reaching across the counter to hand me a napkin. "Also," she added, "to prepare you for the fact that the group thread is now basically a shrine to that picture Ava took." My stomach tensed until she went on, "Don't worry, the comments are 90% people being pleasantly shocked you showed up with someone who isn't afraid of fluorescent lighting, and 10% wanting to know if we met on an app." Nora's already replied with a gif of a latte art heart and a vampire emoji, so the rumor mill is in good hands. I groaned, but the knot in my chest loosened. "So, the whole town knows?" She sipped her coffee like this was all part of her plan. "Let them. Makes it easier when you eventually decide you're keeping me around." I rolled my eyes, but the warmth curling under my ribs had nothing to do with caffeine. We spent the next hour in that strange, suspended space where the night before still lingers but daylight insists on being practical, Katie helping me move a stubborn plant to get more sun, me pointing out the leaky faucet I keep meaning to fix, her promising she could do it without tools, which I both believed and didn't want to think too hard about. At one point, she caught me looking at her hands as she tied her hair back, and I realized I was memorizing the shape of this. Quiet morning, easy conversation, the smell of sugar and coffee, her presence not filling the room but calibrating it. "You're staring," she said without looking up. You're letting me? I countered, and she smiled like I'd passed a test. Eventually, she glanced at the clock and stood, brushing crumbs off her sweater. I have to go before I decide to stay the whole day and undo all my carefully maintained mystery, she said, moving toward the door. But the cafe's open today, right? I nodded. I'll be there, at the corner table, pretending to read something intellectual so I can watch you work. You do realize that's creepy? Deeply, she agreed, opening the door. But I've never pretended otherwise. She left me with a coffee smell still thick in the air and the cinnamon roll half-eaten, and I realized that somewhere between last night's gym and this morning's kitchen, the idea of Katie being in my space had stopped feeling like an intrusion and started feeling like a habit I didn't want to break. By the time I got to the cafe, she was already there, exactly as promised. Corner table, book open but clearly forgotten, eyes following me with the same calm intensity she'd had the first time I saw her. Customers came and went, and every time I glanced over, she was still there, like an anchor I could test the tide against. Around midday, Ava walked in. The room went a little tighter for me, but Katie didn't move, didn't even shift her gaze from the page, as Ava ordered a black coffee and lingered awkwardly by the counter. Can we talk? Ava asked when I brought her drink. I hesitated, then nodded toward a side table. She sat, hands wrapped around the cup, like it was keeping her tethered. I was awful last night, she began, and I almost interrupted, but she held up a hand. I'm not fishing for forgiveness. Seeing you with her, it made me realize how much I've been coasting on this idea of myself from high school and how much I treated you like part of that narrative. You didn't deserve that. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I let the words settle, then said, I don't want you to think you have to apologize every time we see each other. Just treat me like someone whose no means no. She nodded, eyes a little wet.
Deal.
When she left, Katie finally looked up from her book, one brow raised in silent question. I just shook my head and mouthed later, and her gaze softened again. The rest of the afternoon was unremarkable in all the best ways. Lattes poured, tips left, the hum of conversation filling the air, and yet I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, that we'd crossed from pretending into something that neither of us could quite name yet, but both recognized. As I locked up that evening, I saw Katie still sitting there, waiting, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe I thought it was starting to be. The day folded itself into the kind of soft winter brightness that flatters no one and forgives everyone, and by mid-afternoon the reunion committee had somehow conjured a closing brunch. In the same gym, long tables dressed in white paper, chafing dishes steaming like small, hopeful storms, a banner that read thanks for growing up with US in a font that looked embarrassed by its own optimism. I almost texted an excuse. Then remembered I wasn't doing that anymore. Locked the cafe early with a handwritten sign that said back at 3, be nice to yourselves, and found Katie waiting outside with a scarf looped twice and sunglasses, even though the sun was just a rumor. You good with daylight? I asked, too casual, and she huffed a smile, tugging her sleeves down over her wrists. Indirect, short stints, fed and watered, had if we needed. I'm not a melodrama, I'm a set of parameters, and somehow that steadied me more than any vow could. We walked inside by side past kids daring each other to steal balloons and adults daring themselves to be kinder. And I clocked at once the pockets of gossip fizzing around the photo Ava had posted, eyes sliding to us, then back to their eggs, like kindness could be performed as discretion. Katie ignored it with the discipline of a saint who used to be a sinner and drifted toward the shade of the bleachers, letting me decide how visible I wanted us to be, which turned out to be more than I'd expected. Nora waved us over to a table crowded with the odd little coalition you build when a town sticks to your shoes. 2 soccer moms who swore too much, the superintendent who had decided to be charming, the Spanish teacher who cried at toast. Speeches, a guy from biology who now made sourdough starters with names. Plates passed, laughter rose, and I felt the marvel of belonging without shrinking. Halfway through a story about the time the mascot fainted during a fire drill, the committee chair tapped a mic and asked for brief remarks from anyone willing to be brave in front of a buffet, and before fear could chew on me, Nora's elbow landed in my side. Gentle violence. You should. She whispered, "Say the thing you needed someone to say to you." And next to her, Katie didn't speak, didn't push, just set her palm flat on the table, ring finger tapping a slow permission. I surprised myself by standing, by walking to a mic in a gym that had learned my name, by hearing my own voice as if it came from a future that had already forgiven me for being scared. "Hi," I began, unoriginal and sufficient. "I'm Mia. I own the cafe on Maple. I used to think reunions were inventory nights where you counted your failures against other people's highlights and hid the soft parts. Last night, and this morning proved me wrong. So if no one has told you yet, if you opened a tiny shop and it didn't break even, if your marriage looks more like a garden than a fairy tale, if you're sober and bored and proud, if you're lonely and trying anyway, if you brought your girlfriend or your grief or both, this room is big enough. I'm big enough. Also, please tip the custodians and return the cake knives." And the laugh that came felt like the kind that doesn't require a sacrifice. I met Katie's eyes as I stepped down, and there it was again, that look that says, "I see. You passed your performance, and I like you better without it." As I sat, Ava rose from a different table as if to claim a counter moment, and for one breath I braced. But whether it was the daylight or the water, or the apology tax she'd already paid, she kept it small. "I was a lot in high school. I'm trying to be less. If I flipped your ponytail in 2009, I owe you a coffee." And the room laughed and something unclenched. It wasn't absolution, but it was a truce no one had earned and everyone wanted. After, people drifted toward yearbooks like titapools, and I caught snippets of kindness being practiced as a second language. Near the trophies, a cluster formed around a trifold board labeled "Then and Now." And there, hand-lettered in chalk by Nora's quick wrist, someone had added a line. "Most changed. The girl who stopped apologizing for existing." Someone had drawn an arrow toward a Polaroid of me from sophomore year. Hoodie and a grin I barely recognized. Heat climbed my neck, and I half turned to hide until Katie's fingers ghosted the air near my wrist. Never presuming, always near, and I stayed. Practicalities intruded the way they do when life decides to keep going. The hospital nurse in our class recognized the brand of cooler tucked discreetly under the bleachers and asked me, kindly and not in a way that made your stomach go cold, to remind my friend to return borrowed units to the correct bin. I swallowed a laugh and passed the message along like a citizen managing logistics in a secret city. The superintendent asked if the cafe would cater a district meeting. "We pay in actual money, not exposure," he promised, and Katie mouth told you. And the Spanish teacher handed me a napkin with a phone number written twice, once in English, once in hope. When the light tilted toward late afternoon, and the gym air took on that end-of-event melancholy, Nora tugged me to the far wall where she'd chalked a quick mural, steam rising from a cup that looked suspiciously like my mismatched mugs, a ribbon of script that read, "We were here. That's enough. Leave it up for the next game," she told the janitor, who pretended to consider and then winked. Katie watched all of this with an expression that might once have been hunger, but had matured into something like awe. "You built community," she said under her breath, like she was cataloging treasure, not a brand. And for a second I saw the century in her, the parade she'd watched go out of fashion, the inventions that insisted they were new ways to love money, the people she'd chosen anyway, and I wanted to take her hand for the sheer relief of not being the oldest thing in the room. We said goodbye in waves, once at the table, again at the door, a third time in the parking lot where departures always need reinforcements. As we stepped into the cold, my phone pinged, an email from a regional food writer asking if she could feature the cafe in a 10 places that still feel human list. Subject line, "Saw you at reunion. Your speech made me hungry." And I snorted, because if this was the universe rewarding me for not dying of shame, I would take it. "You did that," I told Katie, and she shook her head. "You did that. I'm just the person who brought a fork to the feast." Back at my apartment, the light was already fading toward the kind of early dusk that makes a city feel like a theater between scenes. I should have been exhausted, but the hum under my skin said different. I made tea because coffee would have tipped me into jitter, and she sat on the floor with her back against the couch like a person who has never been invited to this many homes and is trying to memorize the texture of being wanted. The conversation that followed felt like threading a needle. Without pricking either thumb, Boundaries, logistics, ugly truths asked for and given. I won't be turned, I said, the sentence too big for the room and exactly the right size for my mouth. I needed it on the record, needed to name the line I carried like a birthmark. I'm not asking you to be, she answered so fast it tangled my breath. I don't turn. I don't make what I love carry what I hate. I am what I am because someone chose for me without permission. I would rather burn than do that too. You. And I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding that fear until the tendon of it snapped, painless and immediate. She stretched out her legs, looked at her hands like they were a mirror, and added, quieter. If you ever ask in a moment that feels like romance, I will remind you of this conversation. If you ever ask in a moment that feels like grief, I will hold you until you forget how to ask. We let that sit like a blessing and a rule. Then, because life is a pendulum, we swung back to trivialities that felt like offerings. She taught me how to fix the leaky faucet with a coin and a glare. I taught her the trick of slicing cinnamon rolls with unflavored floss. She confessed she doesn't like movies where vampires solve problems with capes. I admitted I own 3 capes and wear them when I count cash because it makes math feel important. When laughter ran out, silence took its place. Unthreateningly, the two of us threaded into it like beads, I noticed, with a thrill I was ashamed of and did not apologize for, that she had chosen the corner of the room farthest from the window and closest to me. How hungry are you? I asked, plain as that, and she closed her eyes and measured. Fed enough to be clever, not fed enough to be stupid. The bandage earlier helped, she added, and winced at her own phrasing. God, that sounded terrible, and I leaned forward, elbows on knees, not to be flirtatious but to be honest. I need you to stop editing how awful parts of this are. I can stand it. I'm not made of sugar. If we're doing this, I need to hear the teeth, too, and the relief that washed over her was almost visible. Then the awful version is this, she said, voice soft. When you cut yourself, I could smell you from across a gym, and every good decision I've practiced for decades gathered into a choir and sang no, 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 and I listened. And it hurt like being good. Always hurts when you've been built for appetite. I will keep hurting like that, gladly, and if I tell you I'm fine, no, I mean I am surviving, not that it is easy. Okay, I whispered, heart banging like a novice drummer. Okay, she echoed, and the echo felt like a vow. Evening slid down the walls. My apartment made the small night noises it makes when it decides to be shelter. A pipe clicking, the fridge clearing its throat, the upstairs neighbor practicing an apologetic scale on a trumpet. I turned on the lamp with the linen shade that makes everything look kinder, and the light found her face in a way that did not flatten it into myth. She was just a woman in her 30s with eyes older than law, choosing me. I stood because I could not sit any longer and set my wrapped hand on her shoulder as carefully as if I were putting a bird back into its nest. Come here, I said, and she rose without hurry, like approaching a skittish animal, and I, not skittish, lifted my chin to meet her halfway. The first kiss wasn't cinematic. It didn't ask the room to applaud. It was a precise, accurate exchange of pressure and breath. A fact we both agreed to write down in the same ledger under the column labeled true. She was gentle to the point of ridiculousness. Until I made a small, involuntary sound that might have been please, and then her hand came up to cradle the side of my face and the care doubled, not the heat, and I understood that with her. Intensity would never be the enemy of tenderness. When we separated, the air felt different, like someone had opened a window in a house I'd been airing out for years. I can stay, she said, not a question and not a presumption. On your couch, on the floor, near the door if you need the space. And I laughed because the specificity was love. Stay in the bed, I said, surprising myself with my own precision. Clothes on, blankets between, the teenage version of this, so my body learns I can want and still sleep, and something like pride crossed her face, bright and fierce. God, I like the way you ask for things, she murmured. We did exactly that, the choreography awkward and holy. 2 people horizontal with 3 pillows too many, my wrapped hand on the duvet between us like a flag, marking a border we had negotiated. In the deep part of night, I woke to the sensation of her breath counting mine, as if calibrating again, and I reached across the treaty line and found her fingers. She flinched once, then laced, and the small sound she made when permission met relief threaded itself into my ribs. Morning would bring more decisions, and the town would find new angles to peer from, and the cafe would need milk, and the superintendent would send a purchase order with a typo we'd giggle at, and somewhere Ava would try to be kinder and succeed, and somewhere Nora would paint us into a margin. For now, in a room that smelled like tea and cinnamon and linen, with a woman who had told me her teeth and her ethics and chosen me anyway, I slept like a person whose humiliation had been alchemized into a future, and when the sun finally pushed its polite face between the blinds, it found us exactly as we had promised, together, untransformed, and ready to keep telling the truth. One small, survivable sentence at a time. Morning didn't so much arrive as seep in, pale and apologetic, sliding under the blinds like it wasn't sure it had permission to touch us. I woke first, which was surprising. Katie had the stillness of someone who had learned to hold herself motionless for hours, maybe decades. Her face relaxed in a way that erased every trace of the careful restraint she wore awake. The blankets were still neatly between us like the agreed-upon treaty, but our hands had wandered in sleep, fingers loosely curled together, and I couldn't remember the last time I had woken up touching someone and not felt an immediate need to move away. I stayed still, cataloging the shape of this quiet, until she opened her eyes in that unblinking way of hers and focused instantly on my face, the corners of her mouth lifting like she'd just remembered a private joke. Morning, I whispered, and she said it back in a voice that sounded like she'd borrowed it from the hour, soft, unassuming, edged with possibility. For a moment we lay there in the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled, and then she sat up, stretching her arms with a precision that made me think of both a dancer and a predator, the movement too controlled to be either entirely. I should go before the sun gets ambitious, she said, glancing at the light leaking through the blinds, but there was no rush in her tone, and when I offered to make coffee, she didn't refuse. We ended up in the kitchen, me at the counter with the French press, her perched on a stool like she'd claimed it without asking, watching me move around my own space like she was memorizing a sequence. You're staring, I said without looking up, and she grinned, unapologetic. I'm allowed. Last night you told me to stop hiding the teeth, so now you get the eyes too. I shook my head, hiding a smile, and slid her a mug across the counter. She wrapped her hands around it the way she had with every warm drink I'd ever seen her hold, like it was alive and might tell her a secret if she was patient enough. We talked about nothing. The weather, Nora's likely reaction to hearing we'd slept in the same bed, whether the cafe needed more mismatched mugs, and the nothingness felt like proof of something bigger. By the time she left, slipping her scarf around her neck with the same deliberate grace, she did everything. The day had fully arrived, the light too bold for her to linger. But she left with a promise to stop by the cafe before closing. The hours between stretched in that strange way time does when you're both anticipating and trying not to anticipate, customers coming and going in a blur until I looked up to see her in her usual corner table, hair still slightly damp from a shower, a book open but clearly ignored. She stayed until the last customer left, and then, instead of leaving with them, she got up and locked the door behind them, flipping the sign to closed with a casualness that made my pulse trip. You trust me with your keys now, she teased, and I shrugged. I trust you with my blood. I think the keys are a smaller risk, and the way her smile faltered for just a breath told me she didn't take that lightly. We moved around each other in the quiet of the empty cafe, me wiping down the counter, her stacking chairs, the rhythm of it easy in a way I hadn't realized I'd been craving. When I reached for a stack of plates on a high shelf and stretched too far, she was there instantly, steadying me with one hand. At my waist, her breath warm against the side of my neck, I froze, not because I was afraid, but because the moment felt like a hinge we could both feel turning. You're warm, she murmured, almost to herself, and then stepped back as if she'd caught the edge of something she wasn't ready to fall into. We finished the closing tasks in a quiet that was more charged than awkward, and when we stepped out into the The air had that early night bite that makes you want to walk slower just to stay in it. She offered to drive me home, but I shook my head. Let's walk. And she didn't argue, just matched her pace to mine, hands in her coat pockets, eyes scanning the street in that subtle, constant way she had. Halfway to my building, she asked, "Do you want me at the brunch tomorrow?" And I laughed. "I want you at all the things now, apparently." Which earned me a look that was part amusement, part something heavier. When we reached my door, she hesitated, then reached out and touched my cheek with the backs of her fingers, so lightly it could have been an accident, except we both knew it wasn't. "Tomorrow, then," she said, and walked away before I could ask if she was talking about the brunch or something bigger. Inside, I leaned against the door, the shape of her touch still warm on my skin, and realized I wasn't counting down to the end of the reunion anymore. I was counting forward to whatever came after, and the math had stopped feeling like a risk. The reunion didn't die so much as molt. By evening, the committee had rebranded the gym one more time as the farewell social. Fairy lights doubled, a rented photo arch appeared like a last-minute promise, and someone found a time capsule we'd buried senior year under a maple by the baseball field and rolled it in like a celebrity. I locked the cafe early with a hand-lettered sign that said "Back tomorrow. Be tender." And when I reached the school, Katie was already there in a charcoal coat and a dark red scarf that made her mouth look like the answer to several questions I hadn't dared ask out loud. The DJ had learned humility since the night before and was playing the kind of music that makes nostalgia behave. Clusters formed and broke, and for a blissfully ordinary 20 minutes, I forgot about anything but the strange joy of being in a room full of people trying to say goodbye to a decade without pretending it had been kinder than it was. Then the capsule ceremony started. The committee chair making a joke about how none of us had known how to use bobby pins in 20, and we crowded close as the lid was pried up to reveal the artifacts of our teenage confessions. A stuffed falcon mascot with a crooked beak, a mixed CD labeled Sophomore Sadness, in Sharpie, a folded blue hoodie that made my lungs stutter because it looked exactly like the one I'd worn every day like armor. They pulled out a stack of notes to future selves and read a few, and when the chair unfolded a sheet with my handwriting, my swoops and cramped seriousness recognizable from a mile, I felt the floor tilt. "Dear future me," she read, and I wanted to call a mistrial, but the room had already gone quiet. "I hope you are brave. If not, I hope you've at least learned to fake it until you can be. I hope you own something. I hope you are kissed by someone who looks at you like you are not a joke. If none of that happened, I hope you still bake on Sundays. Love, Mia." And there it was, proof that the girl I had been had named what I was only now admitting out loud. The sound around us turned into a soft, public "oh," and Katie's fingers ghosted the air near my elbow like a steadying note. I wanted to look at her, and couldn't in that exact second because if I saw her face I might cry, so I looked at the bleacher lights instead and breathed until my eyes dimmed back to usable. The suite cracked fast. Phones buzzed like a hive remembering it was hungry, and a cluster near the exit started pointing at a screen with the urgent schadenfreude of people who have found a narrative to feed. Nora cut through the crowd to us, jaw set, and held up her phone. A post in the reunion thread from someone I barely remembered. Trent, yearbook layout, current proud owner of a drone, captioned, "So anyone else find a medical blood bag in the girls' locker room trash last night?" Shady AF, with a photo of crumpled red-stained tubing artfully framed like a crime scene, comments stacked like kindling. "You/prank/nurses chime in," and then the one that turned the air dangerously thin. A tag of my name and Katie's with a row of side-eye emojis. I felt shame try to bite, fast and stupid, and then anger shoved it aside with two hands. Before I could speak, Ava appeared like a well-meaning storm, cheeks flushed from a fight she hadn't yet had, and announced, louder than necessary, "Shut up, Trent," which bought us 5 seconds of bewildered silence. "People use medical bags for all kinds of reasons," she continued, inconsistent but ferocious. "Low blood sugar, anemia, spooky Halloween props we forgot to throw out. I once kept a tiara from prom for 7 years. Should that make me a suspect? Leave Mia alone." And the fact that she and accuracy had only brushed hands didn't matter. The room had needed a counterweight, and she'd thrown herself on the scale. Katie stood almost perfectly still while this unfolded, a stillness only I could read as calculation and containment. "We can leave," she said under her breath without moving her lips. "I'll take the heat. You don't owe this circus an explanation." And something in me reared up, not to defend myself, but to stop the reflex of running that had written too many earlier chapters. "No," I said, quiet and precise, then louder to the closest set of eyes. "We're staying. If anyone has actual questions, come ask me like a person." And the simplicity of it punctured the gossipy gleam. One of the nurses from our class, the one who'd noticed the cooler at brunch, caught my gaze and mouthed, "You good?" And when I nodded, she nodded back like a professional and turned off the panic valve by very deliberately asking the DJ to play ABBA. The absurdity worked. Bodies shifted back into motion. The thread kept eating itself, and the capsule ceremony limped on, blessedly anticlimactic. I let my breath ease and only then noticed the way Katie's jaw had tightened, the small tendon in her neck standing out like a warning. I touched the back of her hand, brief, and she exhaled, the muscles smoothing. "This is the part where I remind you I have a failsafe," she said so softly only I could hear, absurdly rational in a room of noise. "If ever I look like I'm going to make a choice I hate, press it. I won't be offended." And that was either the least romantic thing anyone had ever said to me or the most. "I know," I answered, and the knowing felt like a key I had already put on my ring. We drifted to the photo arch because the canon of these nights demands evidence, and Nora bullied the volunteer into handing over the Polaroid so she could take a strip of us herself. One with normal smiles, one where I stuck my tongue out and Katie looked at me like she'd waited a century for that exact juvenile gesture, one where she kissed my cheek and the flash caught the precise curve of my surprise and her happiness. I tucked them into my blazer like a spell. "Open mic in 5, someone yelled from the stage, followed by groans and applause. The volunteer MC, emboldened by sugar and the illusion of a room that doesn't judge, begged for non-terrible talent, which unleashed exactly 3 guitars and a consensus spoken word attempt. When he begged for a love song to close it out, the gym fell into the kind of hush that means no one wants to be brave without a script. I felt my body make a decision before my brain filed the paperwork. I stood, tugging Katie with me. "No," she whispered, eyes wide, which would have halted almost anyone. I was not almost anyone tonight. "I can sing badly," I said, grinning. "You can stand there and look at me like I'm better than I am." That's the duet. And she let herself be pulled, half horrified, half delighted. On stage the mic smelled like old pep rally and fear. The DJ, bless him, found an instrumental of a song I'd screamed into my hairbrush at 15. And I sang not well but true, and halfway through, Katie, who absolutely did not sing, leaned in and said into my hair, not the mic, "You are brave," and the world clicked a notch into place. The applause felt like a blanket you accept because you've finally learned how to let yourself be warm. We stepped down into a different room, softened, friendlier, less hungry for proof, and for a breath I let myself relax, so fully I forgot that danger doesn't need an invitation. It arrived anyway in the form of Trent again, emboldened by his own meanness and a shallow victory in the comments, striding up with his phone held like a cross and an expression that made me understand how boys turn into men who call the police because they can. "Quick cue," he said with smarmy brightness. "Is your girlfriend into, like, blood? Because we're all very concerned." And before he could finish the sentence, Katie did something I had never seen her do in public. She let the smallest edge of her age enter her posture. She didn't bare teeth. She didn't lean in. She simply straightened with a dignity so old it erased his bravado like rain erases chalk. "We are not doing this," she said, calm, final. "Your curiosity will survive without my answers. If you are worried about trash management, volunteer to empty bins." And the room, God bless the room, laughed at him, not meanly but decisively, and he flushed a furious, teenage shade and retreated, his power punctured by the absence of an audience. I felt a wave of love so vertiginous it made me sway. Katie caught my elbow as if she were afraid I'd fall into it and drown. "You okay?" she asked, and I said, honest, "No, I'm happy and terrified, and I have been waiting to elect to feel both for a very long time." and she smiled like I had pronounced a password correctly. The MC announced a final slow dance for closure, and the gym obeyed with relief, partners of all histories finding their spots. We moved to the center, and that now familiar circle opened around us, people pretending not to notice they were making space. Katie's hand at my waist, a question she already knew the answer to. Tell me something unromantic, I said, because we had made a rule, and I loved the way it rubbed against the fabric of nights like this. I have to leave town for 2 weeks. Next month, she said immediately, as if she had been waiting for permission to deliver bad news gently. There's an arrangement I manage every few years. It's boring and necessary, and I hate that it looks like a disappearance. And the honesty stung but didn't scar. Tell me something romantic, I countered. I chose this town because you were in it, she said. Simple, factual, devastating. And I laughed breathlessly into her shoulder because somewhere a past version of me was doing cartwheels. In a hoodie. We turned slowly under the fairy lights, and I realized the gym smelled like floor wax and sugar and mercy, a combination I would have sworn impossible, which is when the lights flickered. Not in the flirtatious way they do when a DJ wants to mark a beat, but in that long, wrong blink that makes animals go quiet. The music hiccuped, cut, the speakers hissed, and a hum rose that wasn't electronic. Emergency lights kicked on, painting everything a red theater. A voice at the door said something about a blown transformer in the parking lot and to please stay calm. People did, surprisingly, stay calm. Phones lifting to light faces, murmurs rising, the custodians already moving like chess pieces to check exits. In the weird glow, Katie went very still, head tilted in that animal way I was learning meant listening. What? I asked under the small panic that had crept up my spine. Heartbeat spike. East doors, she said, and even in the mess I marveled at how the sentence had become useful instead of terrifying. We were moving before I knew whose feet were deciding, cutting across the floor to the shadow near the equipment cage where a small knot of movement didn't match the crowds. By the time we reached it, the lights had guttered again, and I made out a kid, one of the soccer mom's sons who'd been running around with a balloon soared all night. On the floor, elbow at a strange angle, eyes wide but dry in that shocky way that always made me want to call a grown-up. I tripped, he said, too bravely, and his mother, white-faced, repeated, he tripped, to the air like an apology. It's okay, Katie said, dropping into a squat with a gentleness that argued with everything supernatural about her. May I? She asked the kid, and when he nodded, she looked up at the mother. I won't move it. I just want to keep it from moving more. And with 2 napkins and the strap from someone's camera, she built a sling as deftly as if she'd done it 1,000 times at 100 different wars, none of which we needed to name. The room exhaled. Someone clapped. The emergency lights blushed less aggressively and flicked to a steady, safer red. The generators groaned themselves awake. The DJ cheered faintly into a dead mic. In that surreal second, lit like suspects in a crime drama, I saw us the way the town would. A woman who owned a cafe and stubbornly showed up to her own life, and a woman who could make a child stop crying with the same hands she'd asked me to press a failsafe into if I ever felt unsafe, and the knowledge shivered through me like a key being copied into a second metal. The fire inspector arrived to say the words adults say when systems fail but buildings won't. The MC declared the dance officially over, and the room translated disappointment into gratitude with more grace than I would have credited us with yesterday. Coats were found. Hugs were given. Jokes about most dramatic ending were made. In the hallway, Katie caught my hand and asked very softly, "Do you want to leave ahead of the herd?" And for the first time in my life I said, "No, let's walk out." Like everyone else, because I finally meant everyone else differently. We filed past the trophy case, and I had the tiny, ridiculous urge to dust our reflections into clarity. At the door, the superintendent thanked us for not trampling each other. The Spanish teacher pressed a Tupperware of leftover cookies into my hands with orders to feed anyone who looked sad. Nora kissed both my cheeks with paint-smudged parting blessings. And Ava, looking wrung out and more human than I thought she was, capable of being in public, touched my arm and said simply, "Be happy," then turned away before I could evaluate it for subtext. Outside, the transformer had indeed given up. a patch of parking lot cordoned by cones, and a municipal truck that made the night smell of hot metal. I looked up at the cold sky and felt both tiny and very present. "Come home," I said to Katie, and there was no reverence in the sentence. Only a decision I wanted to keep making until it bored us with its reliability. Back in my apartment, we lit 2 candles because the outage had chased us, brewed tea on the gas stove like campers with good china, and sat cross-legged on the floor sharing the Spanish teacher's cookies, laughing at how long we'd waited to be ordinary. The power thunked back on 15 minutes later, the fridge proclaiming its resurrection. With a heroic hum, and we cheered like it had saved a life. Then the room went quieter in the way rooms do when the thing that needed to be held has been held and now other truths have time to stretch. I set my mug down, turned toward her, and said the thing that had been waiting since the locker room. "I want this," and I gestured in a way that meant both tiny and everything. "I want you at my worst hours and my soft mornings and the parts of me that aren't brave. I want your rules and your fail-safe and your mouth and your laugh and the way you count my breaths until yours believes it can slow down. I can't promise I won't panic again, but I can promise I won't punish you for being what you are." And the look on her face scared me more than any Fong, because it was hope raw as a newborn. "I want this," she answered, voice wrecked. "I want your stubbornness and your inventory of mugs and your refusal to be turned and your boundary that I will guard with the kind of violence that looks like gentleness. I want to pay for coffee even when you forget to charge me. I want to be the person who gets your text when the oven breaks. I want to be allowed to build a life out of unromantic errands with you." And that, ridiculous and plain, did me in. I leaned across the small space and kissed her once, steady and right, and not as epilogue but as a thesis. We were very close to doing the holy teenage sleep again. The blankets between, the shoulders touching, the breath counting, when my phone buzzed with a tone reserved for the kind of emergencies you hope are wrong numbers. The screen lit with a message from an unknown contact that had sent the locker room photo earlier to half the town. This time it was a video, shaky and grainy, of me in the girls' locker room doorway and Katie turning, mouth stained darker than lipstick, eyes bright in a way that any human would read as wrong, and the caption read, "They're still here tonight. Protect your kids." My stomach dropped through the floor. The buzz became another and another. A knock landed on the front door, heavy and officious in a way neighbors don't knock. Katie's head snapped toward the sound in that way that made me think of wolves and saints. "Do you want me to go out the window?" she asked calmly, no melodrama in it. "Only logistics?" And I stood up so fast my knee hit the coffee table, and we both winced, and then laughed because our bodies still insisted we were ridiculous even when the world was prepping a pitchfork. I looked at the door, then at her, then at the ring I'd threaded on a chain and left on the counter because habit hadn't yet decided if it was superstition or style, and I knew with the kind of knowledge that doesn't ask for a vote that what I did next would become the story the town told about me for a long time. Another knock, louder. "Mia?" A voice called, not cruel, just official. I reached for Katie's hand, pressed my thumb to the cool steel of her failsafe, didn't push, only reminded us both it was there, and said, before I could lose the nerve, "We answer it together." The next knock hit like punctuation, hard and certain, and for a beat all I could hear was the twin rhythms of my pulse and Katie's, not quite in sync, but learning. I stood with her hand in mine, my thumb still on the failsafe, the pressure of it a reminder that even safety here was a negotiation. "Ready?" I asked, and her small, deliberate nod told me she'd already run 100 possible outcomes and decided to stay in this one. I opened the door to find Officer Delgado, who'd been in my year but 2 grades ahead, now wearing the badge with the same awkward grace he'd once worn a Letterman jacket. His flashlight wasn't even on, just his presence in the doorway like a block in a chess game. "Evening, Mia," he said, voice careful. "Mind if I come in?" We've had concerns raised. Behind him the hallway light flickered, the last remnant of the transformer mess, making everything feel just one shade more unreal. I stepped back, and Katie moved with me, her coat still on from earlier like she'd been expecting weather. Delgado's eyes ticked to her and back, and I saw him register something he couldn't name and wasn't ready to say. "There's been chatter," he continued, glancing at his notebook, but clearly quoting from memory, "about an incident in the locker room last night." And some folks think. He stopped, took a breath, and lowered his voice. Look, I know small towns. I know how fast a half-truth becomes a torch. So, I'm asking, not accusing. Is there anything here that's going to get out of hand? Katie spoke before I could. No, she said, steady as stone. Nothing here is a danger to anyone, least of all to her. There was something in the way she said the way her gaze stayed on me, that made Delgado's shoulders ease just slightly, like he'd been holding tension for longer than this conversation. He nodded, closed the notebook without writing a thing. All right. I'll do what I can to keep this from turning into a thing. His eyes flicked to me again. Lock your door. Ignore the thread. And Mia, don't let them make you smaller over rumors. And then he was gone, the hallway door clicking shut behind him. The second it did, I let out a laugh that was half adrenaline, half relief, and Katie just leaned against the wall, watching me with something between admiration and apology. That was close, I said, though the truth was it hadn't been. She'd been calm, contained, like she'd already chosen not to run. Closer than I like, she admitted. But you didn't flinch. That matters. I moved to the kitchen, poured us both water because my hands needed a task, and when I handed her the glass, her fingers lingered around mine. You know, she said quietly, I meant it when I told him you weren't in danger from me. But there's something else I need to say before it gets lost under everything else. She set her glass down, stepped in so close I could smell the faint trace of cinnamon from the cookies. I didn't come into your cafe by accident. I'd seen you before, months earlier, at the farmer's market, laughing with Nora over a crooked baguette. You looked, she shook her head, alive, in a way that made me want to be, too. I've spent a century passing through towns, keeping people at arm's length. And then there you were, and I thought if I'm going to stay anywhere, it should be near that laugh. My throat went tight. You stayed for me. I stayed because of you, she corrected, and something about the precision made my knees feel unreliable. We stood there in the kitchen, the hum of the fridge the only sound, and I realized there was no part of me that wanted to untangle the line between performance and truth from the reunion, because somewhere along the way, it had stopped being a performance at all. I want you here, I said, the words low but steady. Not just tonight. Not just until the thread dies down. I want to build the boring life with you. The one with grocery lists and leaky faucets and too many mugs. Her smile then was the kind you keep in your pocket for bad days. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever asked me. Good, I said. I'm trying to raise the bar. We ended up back on the couch, but this time without the blanket treaty, my head on her shoulder, her arm around me like we'd always fit there. The quiet was different now, not the careful, testing quiet of the beginning, but the kind that settles after a decision has been made. Somewhere outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, but inside it was just us, warm and unremarkable in the best way. You know they'll keep talking, she murmured. Let them, I said. They can make up whatever story they want. We know ours. And then, because it felt like the right ending to the night, I turned my face toward hers and kissed her. Not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. She kissed back with the same certainty, her hand at the nape of my neck, and when we pulled